The land was cracked like ancient pottery, dusty and barren under the merciless sun. James Henderson stood at the edge of his failing cornfield, a single drop of sweat trailing down his weathered face. His reservoir held barely enough water for another week. That's when he saw a hero woman in a mud-splattered electric car, stumbling onto his property, desperate for water. He had every reason to turn her away. Instead, he shared the precious little he had. How could James know that this simple act of kindness would bring salvation to his family's century-old farm? How could he possibly imagine that this stranger would soon stand before the world, fighting for his land and hundreds like it? Or that in just 3 months, the parched soil beneath his boots would transform into the most innovative, sustainable farm in the county? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. James Henderson's hands trembled slightly as he turned the creaking wheel of the well pump. Each rotation felt harder than the last, the metal handle hot from the relentless June sun that had been beating down on Oak Ridge Farm for nearly 6 weeks straight. The drought had arrived earlier this year, more severe than anyone in Willowbrook County had seen in decades. At 52, James wasn't old by most standards, but years of physical labor had taken their toll. His once powerful shoulders now ached with each movement, his knees protesting as he leaned into the pump. Despite the discomfort, he continued, knowing that every drop of water was precious. His weathered face, tanned from years under the sun, showed deep lines of worry that seemed to have doubled in recent months. The farm had been in his family for 4 generations. What had once been 300 acres of thriving cropland had dwindled to just 78 acres after his father's poor investments forced them to sell most of their property. Now, even this remaining land was at risk. The bank's latest letter, the third final notice, sat unopened on his kitchen table. James couldn't bear to read another reminder of his failing dream. When a pathetic trickle of water finally emerged from the pump, James carefully positioned his metal bucket beneath it. The sound of water hitting metal offered small comfort in the oppressive heat. He'd been rationing water for weeks now, prioritizing what little he had for his most viable crops and the small number of livestock that remained after he'd been forced to sell most of his herd. His modest ranch house stood about 100 yards away, its white paint peeling in the heat. The windbreak of oak trees that had given the farm its name provided little relief these days, their leaves curling and browning from lack of rain. Behind the house, vast fields stretched out once, lush with corn and soybeans, now showing more brown than green. 3 more days, he muttered to himself. According to the Weather Service, there was a slight chance of rain in 3 days. But James had stopped believing the forecasts weeks ago, each promised rainfall evaporating before it reached his thirsty land. He lifted the half-filled bucket, its weight feeling twice what it should, and began the walk back to the house. His border collie, Max, trotted alongside him, tongue lolling in the heat. The dog's once energetic gait had slowed, matching his master's careful, conserving pace. "We'll get through this, boy," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. Max looked up at him with loyalty that felt undeserved. James hadn't even been able to fill the dog's water bowl completely for the past week. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Visitors were rare these days, especially in this heat. James turned to see a sleek electric car making its way up his long driveway, kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still air. The vehicle was an expensive model, something that stood out amid the aging trucks and practical sedans common in this rural part of Nebraska. It moved slowly, as if the driver was uncertain. James set down his water bucket, unconsciously moving to block it from view. Resources were scarce, and strangers sometimes meant trouble. Max gave a half-hearted bark, then fell silent, too hot for his usual protective display. The car came to a stop about 20 feet away, its quiet electric motor cutting off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, blinking in the harsh sunlight. James's first impression was that she looked as out of place as her vehicle's city clothes, impractical shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and large sunglasses covered much of her face. Despite the professional appearance, something about her seemed slightly disheveled, as if she'd been traveling for a long time. "Excuse me," she called, taking a tentative step forward. "I'm so sorry to intrude, but I think I'm a bit lost." She glanced back at her car. "My navigation system directed me down County Road 18, but I think I took a wrong turn somewhere, and now my car's overheating." The warning light just came on. James nodded slowly. Electric cars could overheat in extreme conditions, something the city folks who designed them probably hadn't fully considered. "You're about 15 miles off the main highway," he said. "Not much out this way except farms." The woman removed her sunglasses, revealing tired eyes. "I was trying to reach Westfield. I have a meeting there tomorrow." She glanced at her car again, concern evident in her expression. "Is there somewhere nearby I could get some water for the cooling system, and maybe a glass for myself? I hate to impose, but my water bottle is empty, and this heat is—" She trailed off, and James noticed the flush in her cheeks, the slight unsteadiness in her stance. Heat exhaustion, probably. Despite his own precarious situation, years of rural hospitality kicked in. You didn't leave people stranded out here. Not in this heat. It could be deadly. "I've got some water," he said, reaching for his bucket. "Not as much as we'd like, but enough to share." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm Claire, by the way. Claire Bennett." "James Henderson," he replied, not offering his hand, which was calloused and dirt-stained. "This is Oak Ridge Farm. Been here since my great-grandfather's time." Claire looked around, taking in the property. Despite its current state, there was still beauty in the rolling hills, the old oak windbreak, the solid structure of the barn that had stood for over a century. "It's lovely," she said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it. "It's seen better days," James replied, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. He picked up his bucket. "House is this way. You can rest in the shade while I get some water for your car." Claire followed him, her city shoes collecting dust. "The drought seems particularly bad here," she observed. James gave a short laugh. "Worst in 50 years, they're saying. 3rd year in a row we've had below-average rainfall. But this year's different. Groundwater's dropping too. Wells running dry all over the county. And yet you're sharing your water," Claire said, quietly. James didn't respond. What could he say? That his farm was likely weeks away from foreclosure? That the water he was sharing might be the difference between saving one more acre of crops or losing it? That pride was about the only thing he had left? As they approached the house, Max trotted ahead, disappearing through the dog door. The porch offered some relief from the sun, its old ceiling fan turning lazily, pushing around hot air but at least creating a whisper of movement. 2 wooden rocking chairs sat facing the fields, a reminder of evenings long past when there had been time to sit and watch the sunset, when James's wife Laura had still been alive to share those moments. "Please, have a seat," James said, gesturing to one of the rockers. "I'll get you some water." Inside the house, the temperature was only marginally better than outside. James couldn't afford to run the air conditioning except during the hottest part of the day, and even then, he kept it at a conservative 80 degrees. He transferred some of his well water into a glass for Claire and a bowl for Max, then filled a plastic container for her car. Every ounce measured, every drop accounted for. When he returned to the porch, Claire was examining a small potted herb garden that Laura had started years ago, and that James had continued to tend out of habit and memory. Basil, rosemary, and thyme struggled in the heat, but were still alive thanks to his careful watering. "Here," he said, offering her the glass. Claire accepted it with both hands, as if it were precious. "Thank you." She took a small sip, seeming to savor it. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this." James nodded and set the container of water for her car on the porch floor. "That should be enough to cool your system down. You'll want to let the car rest for at least 30 minutes before heading out again. I've been researching water conservation and drought-resistant agriculture for the past 5 years," Claire said, the statement seemingly coming out of nowhere. "But it's different seeing it firsthand. Reading reports doesn't capture—" She gestured to the parched landscape. "This." James's interest was piqued despite himself. "You're some kind of scientist?" Claire smiled slightly. "Something like that. I work with an environmental research foundation. We study sustainable agriculture practices, particularly in areas affected by climate change. James couldn't help the skepticism that crept into his expression. He'd heard plenty from scientists and experts over the years, most offering complicated solutions that required money he didn't have, or suggesting he simply abandoned generations of farming knowledge for trendy new techniques. No offense, ma'am, but I've been farming this land my whole life. My father, and his father before him too. We know drought. This is just a bad one. Claire didn't seem offended. Of course. Generational knowledge is invaluable. But the patterns are changing, Mr. Henderson. The data shows that what used to be considered extreme weather is becoming more frequent, more intense. James looked out at his failing crops. He wanted to argue. But the evidence was right in front of him. This wasn't like the droughts he remembered from his childhood, or the stories his father had told. There was something different, something more persistent about this one. Maybe so, he conceded. But knowing why it's happening doesn't make the corn grow or keep the bank from taking my land. Claire's expression changed, a flash of something determination, perhaps crossing her features. No, it doesn't, but adapting might. She took another sip of water. Would you mind showing me around your farm, Mr. Henderson? While my car cools down? James was surprised by the request. There wasn't much to see these days, except failure and disappointment. But there was something earnest in her question. Something beyond mere politeness. And despite everything, pride in his land ran deep. Even in its struggling state, Oak Ridge Farm had been his life's work. All right, he agreed, though there's not much to look at right now. They started with the closest field, where corn stalks stood, many of them browning prematurely. James explained his irrigation system, the modifications he'd made over the years to conserve water. Claire listened attentively, occasionally asking surprisingly technical questions about soil composition, water retention, and crop rotation. As they walked, James found himself opening up more than he'd intended. He pointed out the areas where he'd tried different drought-resistant strains, explained the challenges of maintaining soil health with limited water, and even showed her the small section where he'd experimented with some of the newer farming techniques he'd read about with limited success. The trouble is, he explained as they stood at the edge of a particularly struggling field, most of these fancy new methods require investment up front. Equipment, infrastructure, specialized seeds. Banks aren't eager to lend to struggling farms, especially ones already carrying debt. Claire nodded, kneeling to examine the soil. She rubbed it between her fingers, assessing its texture and quality. What about grants? There are several programs specifically designed to help farmers transition to more sustainable practices. James scoffed. Paperwork and promises. By the time you cut through the red tape, the growing season's half over. He paused, then added more softly. I did apply for a couple. Got rejected. Seems like they favor larger operations, or farms in different regions. Claire stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. There was a thoughtful expression on her face, as if she were solving a puzzle. Your water situation, how much of a reserve do you have? James hesitated, reluctant to admit just how dire things were. Enough for now, he said vaguely. Claire's gaze was level, seeing more than he'd said. Mr. Henderson, I don't mean to pry, but if you're willing to share some details about your operation, I might be able to point you toward more appropriate resources. My foundation works with farms of all sizes. For a moment, James was tempted to tell her everything: the mounting debt, the failing well, the sleepless nights wondering how to save the legacy his ancestors had built. But pride held him back. He'd accepted charity before, in the years after Laura died. When neighbors brought casseroles and offered to help with chores, it had made him feel diminished somehow, less capable as a man and a farmer. I appreciate the thought, he said stiffly, but we'll manage. Claire didn't push, and James was grateful for that. They continued their tour, moving toward the small orchard where apple trees struggled in the heat. As they walked, Max trotted alongside them, occasionally disappearing to investigate a smell before rejoining their slow procession. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they circled back toward the house. James had shown Claire most of the property now, explaining his operations with a frankness that surprised even him. There was something about her, a genuine interest, a lack of judgment that made it easier to talk about both his successes and failures. As they approached the pawn car, Claire turned to him. "Thank you for the tour, Mr. Henderson. And for the water." She glanced at the container he'd given her, still sitting on the porch. "I should probably be on my way if I want to reach Westfield before dark." James nodded, suddenly aware of how much he'd enjoyed having someone to talk to. The farm could be isolating, especially since Laura had passed. "Drive safely. County Road 18 connects back to the highway about 7 miles east. Just stay straight once you hit the paved road." Claire smiled, reaching into her purse. "Let me pay you for the water and your time." James immediately shook his head. "No need. Wouldn't be right to charge someone for water, especially out here." Claire seemed about to insist, but then nodded in understanding. Instead, she pulled out a business card. "If you ever reconsider looking into those grants or programs, please call me. My foundation might be able to help with the application process." James accepted the card more out of politeness than intention. He glanced at it briefly. Claire Bennett, Environmental Solutions Initiative, before tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Safe travels, Ms. Bennett." As Claire drove away, dust trailing behind her expensive car, James couldn't help but feel a slight emptiness settle over the farm again. The encounter had been a brief respite from his worries. But now, reality came rushing back. He picked up his water bucket, now noticeably lighter after sharing with Claire, and continued his chores. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table reviewing bills by the light of a single lamp, James's hand brushed against the business card in his pocket. He pulled it out, looking at it more carefully this time. The organization seemed legitimate enough, with an address in Chicago and a professional layout. On the back, Claire had written a note. "There's potential in your land, Mr. Henderson. Don't give up on it yet." James sighed, placing the card next to the unopened bank notice. False hope was worse than no hope at all, he thought. Still, he didn't throw the card away. Instead, he finished his simple dinner of canned soup and stale bread, checked on his animals one last time, and went to bed. The weight of the farm's future heavy on his mind. Morning came with no relief from the heat. James rose with the sun, as he had every day for as long as he could remember. The routine of farm life continued, checking irrigation lines, tending to the few animals that remained, assessing which crops might still be salvageable. Each task felt more futile than the last as he watched his livelihood wither under the unforgiving sun. 3 days passed with no sign of the promised rain. James finally opened the bank notice, which contained what he'd expected. A final warning before foreclosure proceedings would begin. 30 days to bring his loan current. An impossible sum given his circumstances. On the 4th morning after Claire's visit, James was surprised to hear tires on his driveway once again. This time, it was a pickup truck, dusty and well-used, bearing the logo of the county extension office. Howard Barnes, the local agricultural agent, stepped out, looking as worn and weathered as James felt. "Morning, James," Howard called, approaching with the familiar gait of someone who'd spent his life walking uneven farmland. He'd known James for decades, had even gone to high school with him, though they'd never been close friends. "Howard," James acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out here?" Howard removed his cap, wiping sweat from his brow. "Got something interesting come across my desk. Thought you might want to hear about it." James leaned against his porch railing, skeptical but willing to listen. Howard wasn't one for wasting time on pleasantries or false promises. "There's a new pilot program looking for farms in this area," Howard explained. "Drought mitigation and water conservation research. They provide the equipment, expertise, even labor. Farm owner keeps all profits, plus a stipend for participating." James frowned. "Who's they?" "Some environmental foundation, partner of the university. Legitimate operation from what I can tell." Howard replaced his cap. "Thing is, they specifically asked about Oak Ridge Farm. Said something about the soil composition and your location being ideal for their study." James's mind immediately went to Claire Bennett. It couldn't be a coincidence. This foundation wouldn't happen to be called the Environmental Solutions Initiative, would it? Howard looked surprised. Yeah, that's the one. You've heard of them? James didn't answer directly. What's the catch, Howard? These types of programs always have fine print. Howard shrugged. Standard research agreement. They collect data, publish findings. Farm has to follow their protocols for the duration of the study, about 2 years. But from what I can see, there's no downside for you. They're not asking for ownership, just cooperation. James fingered the business card in his pocket. Part of him wanted to refuse on principle. This had the feel of charity disguised as science. But with the bank's deadline looming, could he afford to turn down any potential lifeline? I'll think about it, he said finally. Howard nodded, seemingly having expected this response. They're sending someone out next week to talk to interested farmers. I'll put your name on the list, no obligation. He turned to leave, then paused. James, I know you've never been one to take handouts, but this isn't charity. These people need farms like yours for their research. It's a fair exchange. After Howard left, James sat in one of the rocking chairs, staring out at his failing crops. The sensible part of him knew Howard was, this could be the opportunity he needed. But pride ran deep, and accepting help felt like admitting defeat. Max nudged his hand, sensing his internal struggle. James absently scratched behind the dog's ears. What do you think, boy? Am I being a stubborn old fool? The dog offered no answer, just companionable silence as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. That evening, James finally did something he'd been avoiding for weeks. He called his daughter, Rebecca. At 28, she had built a life far from the farm, working as an accountant in Omaha. She had her mother's practical nature and intelligence, but also a fierce independence that sometimes put her at odds with her equally stubborn father. The phone rang several times before she answered. Dad, is everything okay? Her voice carried immediate concern. James rarely called, especially in the evening. Everything's fine, Becca, he said, using the nickname she'd outgrown years ago. Just checking in. There was a pause on the line. Dad, you don't just check in. What's going on with the farm? James sighed. Rebecca knew him too well. It's been a tough season. This drought's worse than most. How bad is it? Her tone was direct, no patience for his tendency to downplay problems. James considered softening the truth, but decided against it. Bank sent a final notice, got about a month before they start foreclosure. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. When Rebecca finally responded, her voice was carefully controlled. Why didn't he tell me sooner? I could have helped with the payments, at least bought you some time. It's not your responsibility, Becca. The farm is my problem. It's our family's legacy, Dad. That makes it my problem, too. Frustration colored her words. What are you going to do? James found himself telling her about Claire Bennett and the research program Howard had mentioned. He explained his reservations, his reluctance to accept outside intervention. Let me get this straight, Rebecca said when he finished. You're considering turning down a program that could save the farm because you're too proud to accept help? Dad, that's... She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. That's not just about you. What about me? What about someday passing the farm to my children, if I have any? Her words hit him hard. He'd always viewed the farm as his responsibility, his burden to bear. But Rebecca was... Rytockridge wasn't just his. It was part of a legacy that extended both backward and forward in time. You're right, he admitted quietly. I'll meet with them next week, hear what they have to say. The relief in Rebecca's voice was palpable. Thank you. And Dad, I'm coming home this weekend. I want to see the farm, see you. After they hung up, James sat for a long time on the porch, watching darkness settle over his land. For the first time in weeks, a fragile sense of hope flickered within him. True to her word, Rebecca arrived that Saturday morning, her small sedan looking out of place next to his aging truck. The moment she stepped out of the car, James was struck by how much she resembled Lorraine, the same determined set to her jaw, the same intelligent eyes. She was dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back, ready for farm work. Their greeting was brief, neither of them given to emotional displays. But when Rebecca hugged him, James held on a moment longer than usual, suddenly aware of how much he'd missed her. "You look thin," she observed, pulling back to study him. "Had you been eating properly?" James shrugged. "Been busy, and grocery runs aren't high priority these days." Rebecca frowned, but didn't much for him. Instead, she grabbed her overnight bed from the car. "I brought supplies, real food, not just those canned beans you live on." Over the next 2 days, Rebecca worked alongside him, tackling farm chores with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up doing them. They repaired irrigation lines, checked on crops, and discussed potential strategies for the future. Rebecca, with her accountant's mind, had brought printouts of various agricultural programs and grants they might qualify for. On Sunday evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset brief, brilliant display of orange and red in the dusty sky, Rebecca brought up the research program again. "So, this woman, Claire Bennett, just happened to break down on your property? And now her foundation wants to use Oak Ridge as a research site. That seems like quite a coincidence." James had been thinking the same thing. Maybe, or maybe she saw something here that fit what they're looking for. Rebecca gave him a sideways glance. "Did you look her up? This foundation?" "Haven't had time," James said, though the truth was, he hadn't wanted to give in to hope enough to investigate. Rebecca pulled out her phone. "Well, I did." She handed him the device, open to a web page. "The Environmental Solutions Initiative is legitimate. Major funding, partnerships with universities and government agencies, and Claire Bennett isn't just any researcher, she's their director and founder. She's actually quite famous in environmental circles." End quote. James scrolled through the page, taking in images of Claire at conferences, accepting awards, standing with groups of scientists in various field locations. There was even a video of her giving a TED talk titled "Water Innovation, Solving the Coming Crisis." She didn't mention any of this, James said, surprised. The woman who had accepted his water and toured his failing farm had seemed dedicated, but not particularly important. "Maybe she didn't want to intimidate you," Rebecca suggested. "From what I can tell, her foundation has had impressive results with their pilot programs. Increased yields, reduced water usage. They seem to specialize in regions facing climate challenges." James handed the phone back, his mind working through the implications. If this organization was as legitimate and successful as it appeared, why would they be interested in his small, struggling farm? "What's your take on all this, Becca? You've always had good instincts." Rebecca considered for a moment. "I think it's an opportunity, Dad. Maybe not just for the farm, but for you. A chance to try something new, to adapt." She looked out at the darkening fields. "Mom would have told you to take it. She always said the Hendersons survived for 4 generations because they knew when to hold firm and when to bend with the wind." The mention of Laura's wisdom brought a tightness to James's chest. She had indeed been the practical one in their partnership, the voice of reason when his stubbornness threatened to get the better of him. "I'll meet with them," he said finally. "Make a decision after that." Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand, a rare gesture of affection between them. "That's all I'm asking." The following Wednesday, as scheduled, a sleek SUV with the Environmental Solutions Initiative logo pulled into James's driveway. He'd spent the morning making the house, and himself, as presentable as possible, though there was no disguising the general state of decline. In the clear light of day, the peeling paint on the house, the rusting equipment in the yard, and the struggling fields all seemed to announce his failure as a farmer and caretaker. He was surprised when Claire Bennett herself emerged from the vehicle, dressed more practically than during her first visit in khaki pants and a light button-up shirt. She was accompanied by a young man carrying a tablet and what looked like soil testing equipment. "Mr. Henderson," Claire greeted him with a warm smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. This is Dr. Marcus Chen, our hydrogeologist." The young man nodded politely. "Pleasure to meet you, sir." James invited them inside, where he'd prepared coffee, a luxury he rarely indulged in these days, but seemed appropriate for a business meeting. They sat at his kitchen table, Claire and Dr. Chen spreading out maps and data sheets. I understand you've spoken with Howard Barnes about our pilot program, Claire began. But I'd like to explain more about why we're specifically interested in Oak Ridge Farm. She proceeded to outline her foundation's work, confirming much of what Rebecca had discovered. Their focus was on developing sustainable farming practices in regions affected by changing climate patterns, with a particular emphasis on water conservation and soil health. When my car overheated on your property last week, it was a fortunate coincidence, Claire explained. I was actually in the area to scout potential farms for our program, though yours wasn't on our initial list. Dr. Chen picked up the explanation, pointing to a geological map. Your property sits on a particular soil composition that retains moisture exceptionally well when properly managed, and you're positioned over a secondary aquifer that hasn't been as heavily depleted as the main regional water table. James frowned. If that's true, why are my crops failing? Why is my well running dry? Because accessing those advantages requires specialized techniques and equipment, Claire said. Traditional farming methods, even good ones like you've been using, aren't optimized for these specific conditions. She outlined their proposal: a complete overhaul of his irrigation system using precision technology, implementation of advanced soil management techniques, and introduction of drought-resistant crop varieties specifically bred for his soil type. All expenses would be covered by the foundation, along with a stipend to offset any potential losses during the transition period. In return, Claire concluded, we monitor and collect data. Your farm becomes a demonstration site for other farmers in similar conditions. We host occasional tours, publish research papers, but the farm remains entirely yours, and all profits go to you. It sounded too good to be true, which immediately triggered James's skepticism. Why me? Why not approach one of the bigger operations in the county? Claire and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. Frankly, Mr. Henderson, your farm is the perfect size for our study, Claire said. Large enough to provide meaningful data, but small enough to implement changes quickly. And your location is ideal for the specific water management techniques we're developing. Dr. Chen added, also, you have a history of careful stewardship. We've reviewed county agricultural records. Despite financial constraints, you've maintained soil quality better than many of your neighbors. That indicates someone who values sustainability, even when it's difficult. James was surprised by this assessment. He'd always tried to farm responsibly, but in recent years, it had felt like a losing battle. What happens after your study ends? Do all these fancy systems go away? No, Claire assured him. Everything we install becomes your property, and we provide training to ensure you can maintain and operate all the technology independently. James asked more questions, probing for the catch he was certain must exist. But for every concern he raised, Claire and Dr. Chen had a reasonable answer. They even provided contact information for farmers in other states who had participated in similar programs. We don't expect an answer today, Claire said as they prepared to leave. This is a significant decision. Take some time to think about it. Call the references we've provided. We'd need to start within 2 weeks to catch this growing season, but there's no pressure. As they walked to their vehicle, Claire hung back slightly. Mr. Henderson, when I stopped here last week and you shared your water with me, a stranger, it told me something about your character. That kind of generosity, especially when resources are scarce, is rare. She handed him a folder with additional information. I believe your farm can be saved. And more than that, I believe it can thrive again. But you have to be willing to try a new approach. After they left, James sat at his kitchen table for a long time, reviewing the materials they'd provided. The technical specifications were beyond his expertise, but the projected outcomes were clear: significant water savings, improved crop yields, and ultimately, a sustainable operation that could withstand future droughts. That evening, he called several of the reference farmers. Their stories were remarkably similar. Struggling operations, transformed by the foundation's interventions. Initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism, and eventually, success. None reported hidden costs or unexpected obligations. He also called Rebecca, sharing the details of the proposal. Her excitement was obvious, her accountant's mind already calculating the potential financial turnaround. "This could save the farm, Dad," she said. "Not just for now, but for generations to come." James knew she was right. Yet something still held him back, not just pride, but fear. Fear of change, fear of failure, fear of losing the familiar even when the familiar was failing him. He slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with withering crops and foreclosure notices. When he woke before dawn, as was his habit, he made his decision. He would accept the foundation's offer, not just for himself, but for the legacy his family had built, for the land that had sustained them for generations, and for the future that Rebecca deserved to have available to her. 2 weeks later, Oak Ridge Farm began its transformation. Claire's team arrived with equipment, experts, and an energy that the property hadn't seen in years. The first phase focused on water management, precision irrigation systems that delivered water directly to plant roots, soil sensors that monitored moisture levels in real time, and the drilling of a specialized well to access the secondary aquifer Dr. Chen had identified. James worked alongside the team, learning the new systems, asking questions, and occasionally offering insights from his decades of experience. To his surprise, the experts valued his input, often modifying their approaches based on his practical knowledge of the land. Claire visited regularly, overseeing the project and ensuring James was comfortable with each new development. During one such visit, about a month into the transformation, they stood at the edge of a field where the first new crops were beginning to emerge, specialized corn varieties designed to thrive with minimal water. "It's working," James said, a note of wonder in his voice. Despite the ongoing drought, these plants looked healthy, their leaves a vibrant green against the dusty landscape. Claire smiled. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what happens when we implement the full soil regeneration program next month." James steadied her, still somewhat puzzled by her personal investment in his small farm. "Can I ask you something? Why did you start all this? Your foundation? This work?" Claire was quiet for a moment, looking out over the field. "I grew up on a farm not too different from this one, in western Kansas. My parents lost it during a drought in the late 90s. I was 15. Her voice held old pain. "I watched everything they'd built disappear because they didn't have access to the right resources or information. After that, we moved to the city. My parents never recovered from the loss." She turned to face him. "I promised myself I'd find ways to prevent other families from experiencing that. I studied environmental science, hydrology, agricultural technology, anything that might help farmers adapt to changing conditions." The foundation grew from there. James nodded, understanding her motivation in a way he hadn't before. "Your parents are they still alive? Have they seen what you've accomplished?" A shadow crossed Claire's face. "My father passed away 5 years ago. My mother lives in Denver now. She's proud of the work, but she's never been able to bring herself to visit any of our farm projects. Too many memories." She gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe someday." The conversation created a new understanding between them. James no longer saw Claire as an outsider imposing city solutions on rural problems, but as someone who understood the deep connection between farmers and their land. For her part, Claire seemed to recognize something of her own father in James. The same stubborn determination, the same deep love of the soil. By mid-August, the transformation of Oak Ridge Farm had progressed significantly. The new irrigation system was fully operational, delivering precisely measured amounts of water to each section of the farm based on real-time soil moisture readings. Solar panels had been installed on the barn roof, reducing electricity costs for pumping water, and the specialized well was providing access to the deeper aquifer, ensuring a stable water supply despite the ongoing drought. The most visible change, however, was in plate. The crops themselves, where brown, withering plants had stood just months before, new growth emerged still modest compared to the bountiful harvests of years past. But a dramatic improvement nonetheless. The specialized corn varieties were knee-high and thriving. The test plots of drought-resistant wheat showed promise. Even the small orchard was responding to the new care regimen, with the apple trees producing fruit for the first time in 3 years. Word had spread throughout the county. Neighboring farmers began to stop by, curious about the activity at Oak Ridge. James found himself in the unexpected position of tour guide, explaining the new systems with growing confidence. Some visitors were skeptical, others openly envious of the foundation's investment, but all left with something to think about. Seeds of possibility planted in minds as parched for hope as the land had been for rain. Rebecca visited again in late August, her eyes widening as she took in the changes. "It's incredible, Dad," she said as they walked through fields that now showed more green than brown. "I can hardly believe it's the same farm." James nodded, a cautious pride warming his chest. "Still early days. Won't know the full results until harvest. But the soil moisture readings are better than they've been in years." Rebecca smiled at his characteristic understatement. "Howard Barnes told me you've become quite the local celebrity. Said there's talk of organizing a county-wide workshop here in the fall." James scoffed, though not as dismissively as he might have months ago. "People are just curious. Once the novelty wears off, they'll go back to their own concerns." "Maybe," Rebecca said, "or maybe you're showing them a way forward." She paused by a soil sensor, examining the small solar panel that powered it. "You know, the bank called me." James stopped, tension immediately returning to his shoulders. The bank had granted a temporary stay on the foreclosure proceedings after Raul, receiving documentation from the Environmental Solutions Initiative about the pilot program. But the underlying debt remained. What did they want? "To discuss refinancing options," Rebecca said. "Apparently, having the foundation's backing changes your risk profile. They're willing to restructure the loan, lower the interest rate. I've been running the numbers. With the projected increase in yield and decrease in water costs, you could be solvent within 2 years." The news was almost too good to process. James had been so focused on the day-to-day work of transforming the farm that he pushed financial concerns to the back of his mind. "You're sure about this?" Rebecca nodded. "I wouldn't give you false hope, Dad. It's still going to be tight, and you'll need at least 2 good harvests, but it's doable." She hesitated. "There's something else." From her tone, James knew this something else might be more challenging. "Go on." "I've been thinking about the farm, about the future." Rebecca looked out across the fields, her expression thoughtful. "What would you think about me coming back? Not right away, but maybe in a year or 2. I could keep my accountant job, work remotely most of the time, help modernize the business side of things." The suggestion caught James completely off guard. Since Laura's death, he'd assumed Rebecca's connection to the farm was primarily sentimental, a childhood home to visit occasionally, but not a place she'd want to return to permanently. "You'd want that? To come back here?" Rebecca's expression was earnest. "I've been thinking about it more and more, especially seeing what's happening now. This place has always been home, Dad, and watching you almost lose it made me realize how much it means to me too." She gave a small laugh. "Plus, my apartment in Omaha costs a fortune, and my neighbors play terrible music at all hours." James felt a surge of emotion he wasn't prepared for. The possibility of not being alone on the farm, of sharing the work and the legacy with his daughter, was something he hadn't dared to hope for. "You'd be welcome," he said simply, his voice gruff with feeling. "Always." September brought the first true test of the new systems, when a heat wave pushed temperatures well above normal for 3 straight weeks. Farms across the county suffered, crops wilting under the relentless sun. But at Oak Ridge, the advanced irrigation kept pace with the increased water demand. The soil monitoring systems automatically adjusting the schedule to provide optimal moisture levels. It was during this heat wave that Claire brought her first official tour group to the farm representatives from the state, agricultural department, university researchers, and a handful of climate scientists. James found himself speaking to the group with unexpected confidence, explaining the practical applications of the new technology and the real-world results they were seeing. "The key is precision," he told them as they stood in a field of thriving corn. "We're using 40% less water than I would have with my old system, but each plant is actually getting what it needs, when it needs it." One of the university researchers asked about the cost feasibility for average farmers. James was honest. Without the foundation's support, most of this would be out of reach for operations my size. But there are elements that could be implemented incrementally, starting with soil monitoring and targeted irrigation. The return on investment comes faster than you might think. Claire stood at the back of the group, a small smile playing on her lips, as she watched James field questions with growing authority. Later, when the visitors had departed, she joined him on the porch. "You've become quite the spokesperson for sustainable agriculture," she observed, accepting the glass of iced tea he offered. James shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "Just telling them what works and what doesn't. Figure that's worth more than theory." "Exactly," Claire agreed. "That's why these demonstration farms are so valuable. Farmers trust other farmers, far more than they trust researchers or government officials." She took a sip of her tea. "We're getting requests from other counties to visit. Word is spreading about what's happening here." James was surprised. People are interested in what we're doing? Even with only partial results? "Especially now," Claire confirmed. "This heat wave has everyone worried about water security. What you're achieving here, maintaining crop health with significantly reduced water usage, that's exactly what they need to see." The realization that his farm, which months ago had been on the brink of failure, was now being viewed as a model for others, was difficult for James to process. Pride warred with humility, excitement with caution. "Just doing what needs doing," he said finally. "Can't say I fully understand all the science behind these systems yet, but I can see the results well enough." Claire's expression turned serious. "Speaking of results, there's something I wanted to discuss with you. Our foundation has been approached by a major agricultural publication. They want to do a feature story on one of our pilot farms, highlighting the technology and the outcomes. We'd like that farm to be Oak Ridge." James frowned. "You mean reporters? Photographers? All that?" Claire nodded. "It would involve a journalist spending a couple of days here, interviewing you, documenting the technology. The story would reach farmers nationwide." She paused. "It's completely your choice, of course. But it would be valuable for the foundation, and potentially for you as well." The old James would have refused immediately. Privacy had always been important to him, and the thought of strangers examining his operation, asking personal questions, felt invasive. But the past months had changed him. He'd seen firsthand how sharing knowledge could benefit others facing similar challenges. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "Talking over with Rebecca." Claire seemed pleased even with this non-committal response. "Of course. There's no rush." She finished her tea and stood to leave. "By the way, we're getting excellent data from your soil sensors. The regeneration protocol is working better than we anticipated. Dr. Chen is quite excited about the preliminary results." After Claire left, James sat on the porch until sunset, watching the golden light play across his fields. The farm still faced challenges. One season of improved yields wouldn't erase years of accumulated passion. But for the first time in a long while, he felt genuine hope for the future. That hope was tested in early October when an unexpected storm system brought high winds and hail to parts of the county. James spent a tense night listening to ice pellets crackle, tat-tat against the roof, imagining the damage being done to his nearly mature corn. When morning came, he pulled on his boots and coat, dreading what he might find. To his amazement, the damage was minimal. The specialized corn varieties had stronger stalks than traditional types, allowing them to withstand the wind better. And while some of the outer leaves showed hail damage, the ears themselves were largely protected. In contrast, reports from neighboring farms indicated significant losses, with some fields completely flattened. Howard Barnes visited the following day to assess the storm's impact. "You got lucky, James," he said as they surveyed the fields. "Or maybe not just luck. These new varieties are tough." James nodded. "They're designed for resilience, not just drought tolerance." Claire's team tested them against multiple stress factors. Howard gestured to a neighboring property visible in the distance, where fallen corn stalks created a chaotic pattern across the field. Frank Olson lost about 60% of his crop over there. Same with the Johnsons to the south. He turned to James with a serious expression. "They're asking questions about what you're doing here. Real questions this time, not just curiosity." This news gave James pause. The success of his farm relative to his neighbors' struggles created a complicated dynamic. There had always been a spirit of competition among local farmers, but also a strong sense of community. No one wanted to succeed at others' expense. "Tell them they're welcome to stop by," James said after a moment's thought. "I'll show them what we've implemented, explain how it works." Howard looked relieved. "That's good of you, James. Might be worth organizing something formal. A kind of open house. County Extension Office could help coordinate." The idea of hosting a group of neighboring farmers, some of whom he'd known his entire life, made James nervous. What if they saw his partnership with the foundation as a betrayal of traditional farming methods? What if they resented the advantages he'd been given? But he also recognized the opportunity to help his community, to share what he'd learned. "Set it up," he agreed. "Sooner rather than later, before harvest gets into full swing." The following week, 15 local farmers gathered at Oak Ridge. Some James knew well. Others he recognized only by reputation. All wore expressions of guarded interest as he led them through the property, explaining the new systems and technologies, the specialized crop varieties, the water RAS, management techniques. "The foundation covered the costs for us as a research site," James explained carefully, "but there are elements that could be implemented on any farm, at different price points." He showed them the soil sensors, the precision irrigation nozzles, the water recycling system. Each component helps on its own. Together, they create a more resilient operation. Frank Olson, a third-generation farmer whose family had always been friendly competitors with the Hendersons, asked the question that was likely on everyone's mind. "And what's the foundation get out of this? What's their angle?" James appreciated the directness. "Data, research outcomes they can publish, proof that their methods work in real-world conditions." He looked around at the group. They're not looking to buy land or sell expensive equipment. They're trying to develop solutions for farming in changing conditions, solutions that can be replicated. The discussion continued, becoming more technical as farmers asked specific questions about costs, implementation challenges, and expected returns. James answered as honestly as he could, acknowledging what he didn't yet know, sharing the preliminary yield projections that Dr. Chen had provided. By the end of the tour, several farmers had taken contact information for the foundation. Others remained skeptical but thoughtful. No one dismissed the results. They could see with their own eyes healthy crops, standing tall after a season that had devastated many in the region. As the group dispersed, Frank lingered. "Never thought I'd see the day when James Henderson became an innovator," he said, but his tone was more admiring than mocking. "Your father always said you were the most traditional farmer in the county. Said you'd sooner plow with horses than try a new seed variety." James had to smile at the characterization, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. Circumstances change a man, I suppose, especially when the alternative is losing everything. Frank nodded soberly. "Well, I'm paying attention now. Might be giving that foundation of yours a call myself." He extended his hand, and James shook it, feeling a newfound respect in the gesture. That evening, James called Rebecca to tell her about the farmer's visit. "It went better than I expected," he admitted. "No one accused me of selling out or going soft." Rebecca laughed. "Did you seriously think they would?" "Wasn't sure," James said. "Change doesn't always come easy in farming communities." "Especially when the change comes from outside," Rebecca acknowledged. "But you're not an outsider, Dad. You're one of them. If you say something works, they'll listen." The conversation turned to the upcoming harvest, which would begin in earnest the following week. Early indicators suggested yields significantly above what James had produced in recent years, though still not matching the farm's best seasons from decades past. "Dr. Chen says that's to be expected," James explained. "The soil is still regenerating. Each season should show improvement as the organic matter builds up and water retention increases." "And the bank is satisfied with the projections," Rebecca added. "I finalized the loan restructuring today. As long as the harvest meets 80% of the forecast, you're secure for the next growing season." Relief washed over James. The immediate threat of foreclosure that had hung over him for months was finally lifted. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, But the path forward was clearer now. Harvest began under ideal conditions: clear skies, moderate temperatures, low humidity. The combine moved through the fields with satisfying efficiency, the yield monitor confirming what visual inspection had suggested: a substantial improvement over recent years. James worked from dawn until well after dusk, taking breaks only when necessary, driven by a mixture of determination and renewed hope. Claire visited midway through the Sepra harvest, bringing Dr. Chen and several other Foundation staff to collect samples and data. They moved through the fields methodically, measuring, documenting, analyzing. James continued his work, glancing occasionally at the researchers with their tablets and instruments, still somewhat amazed that his modest farm had become a scientific testing ground. During a lunch break, Claire approached him, excitement evident in her expression. "The preliminary results are even better than we anticipated," she said. "Not just in terms of yield, but soil health indicators, water efficiency metrics, carbon sequestration. Oak Ridge is becoming exactly the kind of demonstration site we hoped for." James accepted the praise with a nod, still uncomfortable with too much optimism. "Still got a ways to go before we're back to what this land could produce in its prime." "Of course," Claire agreed. "Soil regeneration is a multi-year process. But the trajectory is clear." She hesitated before continuing. "James, about that magazine feature we discussed, they're still very interested. Their readership includes farmers across the country facing similar challenges. Your story could help them see possibilities they hadn't considered." James had been thinking about the proposal since Claire first mentioned it. His initial reluctance had gradually given way to a recognition of potential value not just for the Foundation or himself, but for others. Struggling, as he had been. "I'll do it," he said simply. "Send it up after harvest is complete." Claire's smile was warm. "Thank you. I think you might be surprised by the impact your story could have." By early November, the harvest was complete, the final numbers exceeding even the optimistic projections. While still below historical peaks, the yield represented a dramatic reversal of the farm's declining productivity. The specialized corn had performed exceptionally well, producing robust ears despite the challenging conditions. The test plots of drought-resistant wheat had also shown promise, suggesting possibilities for crop diversification in future seasons. The journalist from the agricultural magazine arrived in mid-November, a thoughtful woman named Sarah Peterson, who had grown up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and understood the realities of agricultural life. She spent 3 days at Oak Ridge, interviewing James extensively, photographing the new systems, and documenting the transformation process. James found himself speaking more openly than he'd expected, sharing not just the technical details but the emotional journey as well. The pride that had nearly cost him the farm, the initial skepticism about outside help, and the gradual recognition that adaptation was not surrender, but survival. "What would you tell other farmers who are facing similar challenges?" Sarah asked on her final day, as they stood looking out over the now harvested fields. James considered the question carefully. "I'd say that change doesn't mean abandoning everything you know. It means building on it, adding new knowledge to old wisdom." He paused, organizing his thoughts. Farming's always been about adapting to weather, to markets, to new technologies. What's different now is the pace of change. We can resist it and fail, or embrace it and find new ways to succeed. After Sarah left, promising the article would appear in the January issue, James felt strangely exposed. He'd shared more than he typically would with a stranger, opened up about failures and fears that he'd previously kept private. But there was also a sense of purpose in having done so. If his experience could help even one other farmer avoid the path he'd nearly taken, it would be worth the discomfort. December brought colder temperatures, but little snow, the drought conditions persisting despite the change in seasons. James used the quieter winter period to study the data from the growing season, working with Dr. Chen to understand the soil test results and plan improvements for the following year. He also began taking online courses in agricultural technology and water management. gradually building his knowledge to match the advanced systems now operating on his farm. Rebecca came home for Christmas, bringing with her detailed plans for expanding their participation in the Foundation's research program. She'd been in regular contact with Claire, discussing possible next steps as Oak Ridge moved from crisis management to longer-term sustainability. They're interested in adding a regenerative grazing component, she explained as they sat at the kitchen table, laptops open, papers spread before them. Small scale at first, just a few head of cattle managed intensively to improve soil health in the fallow fields. James studied the proposal. The approach was different from traditional cattle operations, with frequent movement of animals in high density for short periods, allowing plants to recover fully between grazing. The goal was not just meat production, but soil improvement, the animals becoming part of a biological system rather than a separate enterprise. Never managed cattle that way, he admitted. Would take some learning. Rebecca smiled. That's the point, isn't it? Learning new approaches, adapting. She sounded so much like her mother in that moment that James felt a pang of both grief and pride. Laura would have embraced these changes, would have seen the possibilities rather than the challenges. Your mother would be proud of you, he said suddenly, of how you've taken on this place, its future. Rebecca's expression softened. She'd be proud of both of us. Especially you, Dad. Not many people could change course the way you have. The new year began with unexpected recognition. The magazine article, titled Resurrecting Oak Ridge, How One Farmer's Leap of Faith is Changing Midwestern Agriculture, was published to significant attention within the farming community. The piece was more personal than James had anticipated, portraying not just the technical transformation of the farm, but his personal journey as well. Photographs showed him standing in thriving fields, operating the new precision equipment, and sitting on his porch with Max at his feet. The final image was particularly striking. James and Claire walking side by side through a newly planted test plot, engaged in animated conversation. The sunset casting long shadows across the regenerating land. The article generated a flood of inquiries from farmers facing similar challenges, agricultural extension offices seeking information, even policymakers interested in the broader implications of the Oak Ridge model. James found himself in the unexpected position of environmental advocate, speaking with a quiet authority born of practical experience rather than academic credentials. Claire called the day after publication, her voice animated with excitement. James, the response has been extraordinary. We've received over 200 emails already, most from farmers asking how they can implement similar systems. James was still processing the attention, didn't expect this kind of reaction. Just told my story, as it happened. That's exactly why it's resonating, Claire explained. You're not a scientist or a politician. You're a farmer speaking to other farmers about real solutions. She paused. There's something else. The governor's office called. They're forming a task force on agricultural sustainability and climate adaptation. They want both of us to participate. The invitation was so far outside James's comfort zone that his first instinct was to refuse. He was a farmer, not a policy advisor. What could he know about task forces and government initiatives? But the thought of Rebecca's face when he told her about the opportunity stopped him from declining immediately. What would this involve exactly? He asked. Quarterly meetings in the state capitol, reviewing proposed programs, offering practical feedback from a farmer's perspective. Your input would help ensure that new policies actually work for the people they're supposed to benefit. James promised to consider it, and after discussing the opportunity with Rebecca, he decided to accept. His daughter's enthusiasm was difficult to resist, and he recognized that this was a chance to influence programs that could help farms throughout the region. The winter passed in a blur of activity. In addition to the regular care of the property during the off-season, James hosted a steady stream of visitors, individual farmers curious about the systems, university students studying sustainable agriculture, and local officials concerned about regional water security. The foundation provided support for these visits, with Dr. Chen often present to answer the more technical questions, but increasingly, James found himself able to explain the science behind the practices. By early March, preparations for the new growing season were well underway. The regenerative grazing component that Rebecca had proposed was being implemented, with a small herd of cattle introduced to the property using the intensive management approach. Solar-powered mobile fencing allowed precise control of grazing patterns, with the animals moved daily to prevent overgrazing and maximize soil impact. Claire visited more frequently during this period, often staying for several days to oversee the expansion of the research program. James found himself looking forward to these visits, not just for the technical guidance she provided, but for her company as well. She brought an energy and enthusiasm to the farm that had been missing since Laura's death, a sense of possibility that extended beyond mere survival to genuine innovation. During one such visit in late March, as they walked the property assessing the winter's impact on soil conditions, Claire broached a new subject. "The Foundation is considering establishing a permanent research station in this region," she said, her tone casual but her expression suggesting the significance of the statement. "A place where we could conduct longer-term studies, train farmers in new techniques, demonstrate technologies in a real-world setting." James nodded, understanding the value of such a facility. "Makes sense. The work you're doing deserves a proper home base. We've been looking at potential locations," Claire continued. "Properties that offer the right combination of soil types, water access, infrastructure." She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Oak Ridge would be ideal." The implication took a moment to register. "You want to buy my farm?" James felt an immediate resistance, a protective instinct toward the land his family had tended for generations. Claire shook her head quickly. "No, not buy it. Partner with you. We'd establish the research station here. Expand the current programs, bring in additional staff and resources, but the farm would remain yours, operated according to your expertise, with your full participation in all decisions." She hesitated. "It would mean significant additional income for you, complete debt relief, and a guaranteed market for your products through our network of sustainability-focused buyers." The proposal was unexpected and complex. James needed time to process the implications, the potential benefits and risks. "This is a big decision," he said finally. "Something I'd need to discuss with Rebecca." Claire nodded in understanding. "Of course. There's no rush. Think it over. Talk with Rebecca. I can provide more detailed information about what the partnership would entail." She smiled. "Whatever you decide, the current research program continues either way. This would just be an expansion, a more permanent relationship." That evening, James called Rebecca to discuss the proposal. Her initial reaction was cautious enthusiasm, tempered by the same protective instinct toward the family property. "It sounds like an amazing opportunity," she said. "But I understand your hesitation. This farm is more than land and buildings to us." "Exactly," James agreed. "Your great-grandfather built that barn with his own hands. Your mother planted those oaks by the eastern fence." The emotional connection to the property was profound, a living link to generations past. "But Dad," Rebecca said gently, "remember what Mom always said? A farm is about the future, not just the past." She believed in adaptation, in finding new ways to keep the land productive and the family connected to Ball. The reminder of Laura's philosophy gave James pause. She had indeed been forward-thinking, often pushing him to consider new approaches when his natural inclination was to stick with traditional methods. What would she advise now? "Let's get more information," he decided. "Understand exactly what this partnership would mean in practical terms. Then we can make a decision that honors both the past and the future." Over the next few weeks, as spring planting began, James and Rebecca met several times with Claire and the Foundation's legal team, reviewing detailed proposals for the research station partnership. The terms were more favorable than James had anticipated. Full ownership of the land would remain with the Henderson family, with the Foundation leasing portions for research purposes. James would serve as both operational manager and research advisor, his practical knowledge valued equally with the scientist's theoretical expertise. Perhaps most significantly, the proposal included a provision for training programs that would allow other farmers from the region to learn the new techniques, ensuring the benefits extended beyond Oak Ridge itself. This aspect particularly appealed to James, addressing his concern that the farm's success might isolate it from the community rather than strengthen local agriculture as a whole. By early April, with spring planting well underway, James and Rebecca made their decision. they would accept the partnership, transforming Oak Ridge from a struggling family farm into a center for agricultural innovation while maintaining its heritage and identity. The foundation would begin construction of research facilities that summer, with the full program operational by the following growing season. The announcement generated both excitement and some skepticism within the local farming community. Most neighbors recognized the potential benefits jobs created by the research station, training opportunities for local farmers, increased visibility for regional agriculture. But a few viewed the partnership as a surrender to outside interests, a betrayal of traditional farming values. Frank Olson, who had become one of the foundation's most enthusiastic local supporters after seeing the results at Oak Ridge, defended James vigorously at a town hall meeting where the plans were presented. "James Henderson isn't selling out," he told the gathered farmers. "He's showing us a way forward. We can learn from what's happening at Oak Ridge, or we can watch our own farms fail one by one as conditions get tougher." The debate within the community continued, but the transformation of Oak Ridge proceeded. Spring brought new growth to the revitalized soil, the specialized crop varieties thriving under the precision management systems. The cattle grazing program showed promising early results, with noticeable improvements in soil structure and plant diversity in the treated areas. In May, almost exactly a year after Claire's car had overheated on his property, James stood with her on a hilltop overlooking the farm. Construction had begun on the first research building, a modern structure designed to blend with the rural landscape while housing sophisticated laboratories and training facilities. Around them, the fields showed vibrant growth, a stark contrast to the struggling crops of the previous year. "I never imagined this," James admitted, surveying the activity below. Workers moved efficiently through the property, installing new monitoring equipment, tending to the experimental plots, managing the cattle herd. "A year ago, I was just trying to hold on long enough to pay the next bill." Claire smiled, the satisfaction evident in her expression. "That's how change happens sometimes. We resist until we can't anymore. Then we adapt and discover new possibilities." She gestured toward the horizon, where several neighboring farms were visible. "And it spreads. 3 of your neighbors have already implemented elements of the water conservation system. 2 more are starting soil regeneration programs this season." The ripple effect was perhaps the most gratifying aspect of the transformation. Each farmer who adopted even a portion of the Oak Ridge approach represented land healed, water conserved, a livelihood preserved. The model was proving adaptable to different scales and circumstances, not a rigid system, but a flexible framework that could be customized to individual needs and resources. Rebecca had made the decision to return to the farm permanently, working remotely for her accounting firm 3 days a week and devoting the rest of her time to developing the business side of Oak Ridge. Her modern approach to marketing, combined with the farm's growing reputation for innovation, had attracted premium buyers willing to pay more for sustainably produced crops. The financial situation, once so desperate, had stabilized. The bank loan had been restructured on favorable terms, with the foundation providing backing that virtually eliminated the risk of foreclosure. The first full season's harvest under the new systems was projected to generate a modest profit, not wealth by any measure, but a crucial step toward long-term viability. "There's one more thing I'd like to show you," Claire said, leading James back toward his truck. They drove to a section of the property that had been particularly unproductive in recent years, the soil depleted by decades of intensive farming before the Hendersons had acquired it. The foundation had designated this area for a special restoration project, a demonstration of how even severely degraded land could be revitalized. As they approached, James was surprised to see a group of people working in the field, not the usual research team or farm workers, but children and teenagers, supervised by several adults. They were planting trees along carefully marked lines, each sapling protected by a biodegradable guard. "What's this?" James asked, confused by the unexpected activity. Claire smiled. "A community initiative, local schools partnering with the foundation to create a demonstration forest. The students learn about ecosystem restoration while helping establish a windbreak that will benefit the CI farm for generations to come." She gestured toward the young planters. "They're using a variety of native species selected for drought tolerance and carbon sequestration. In 20 years, This will be a thriving ecosystem supporting wildlife, protecting soil, and serving as an educational resource. The sight of young people investing in the future of his land touched James deeply. These children, many of whom probably had little connection to agriculture in their daily lives, were now literally putting down roots in rural soil. Their work represented exactly what the partnership with the foundation was, about building bridges between different worlds, different generations, different approaches to caring for the land. As if sensing his thoughts, Claire added, "We believe sustainable agriculture isn't just about new technologies or farming methods. It's about reconnecting people to the land, helping them understand where their food comes from and why healthy soil matters to everyone, not just farmers." James watched a young girl carefully place a sapling in the ground, her expression serious as she tamped the soil around its base. "Laura would have loved this," he said quietly. Bringing children to the farm, teaching them about the land, it was something she always wanted to do. Claire nodded in understanding. Rebecca mentioned that. She said her mother had dreamed of opening the farm to school groups, creating educational programs. She hesitated. "If you're comfortable with it, we'd like to name the Community Education Center after Laura." Recognition of her vision, even if she didn't live to see it realized. The suggestion brought unexpected emotion. James had worked hard to keep Laura's memory alive in private ways, maintaining her herb garden, following routines they'd established together. But the idea of a public acknowledgement of her influence, her values, was something he hadn't considered. "She would be honored," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling. "And so would I." As they walked among the young tree planters, James found himself introducing them to Claire with a pride that surprised him. "This is Ms. Bennett," he told them. "She's the one who made all this possible. A year ago, she stopped here looking for water when her car overheated, and that changed everything." The children listened with interest as Claire briefly explained her work, her foundation's mission to help farms adapt to changing conditions. One boy, about 12 years old, asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Did you know Mr. Henderson's farm was in trouble when you stopped here? Is that why you picked it?" Claire smiled at the directness of the question. "No, I didn't know anything about Oak Ridge when my car broke down. I was just a traveler who needed help, and Mr. Henderson shared his water with me even though he didn't have much to spare." She looked at James, her expression warm. "Sometimes the most important connections happen by chance. But what we've built here since then, that's been the result of hard work, trust, and a willingness to try new approaches." The explanation satisfied the young questioner, who nodded seriously before returning to his tree planting. James and Claire continued their tour of the property, discussing plans for the coming months, the expansion of the research program, and the increasing interest from other farmers in the region. As they walked, James found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the brink of losing everything to becoming a model for sustainable agriculture, from isolation to community, from despair to purpose. The transformation wasn't just in the soil or the crops or the infrastructure, but in his own perspective. He had rediscovered what had drawn him to farming in the first place, not just tradition or obligation, but a deep connection to the land and a desire to nurture it for future generations. The summer brought the first anniversary of Claire's initial visit to Oak Ridge. To mark the occasion, the foundation organized a field die-in open house for farmers, researchers, policymakers, and community members to see firsthand what had been accomplished. Over 200 people attended, touring the property in small groups, attending workshops on specific techniques, asking questions about implementation and results. James found himself at the center of attention, a position that would have made him deeply uncomfortable a year earlier. Now, he moved through the crowds with quiet confidence, explaining the systems, sharing the challenges they'd faced, offering realistic assessments of what had worked and what still needed refinement. His honesty and practical knowledge resonated with the visiting farmers, who recognized in him not a scientific expert, but a peer who had navigated difficult changes and emerged stronger. Rebecca, who had officially relocated to the farm that month, managed the business aspects of the event with impressive efficiency. She had transformed the old office in the farmhouse, into a modern operations center, with digital mapping of the property, real-time monitoring of soil and crop conditions, and sophisticated financial tracking systems. Her vision for Oak Ridge extended beyond survival to genuine prosperity, not measured solely in profits, but in sustainability, resilience, and community impact. During a lunch break, as visitors enjoyed a meal featuring products from Oak Ridge and neighboring farms, Claire approached James with an unexpected guest, an elderly woman whose features immediately reminded him of Claire herself. "James, I'd like you to meet my mother, Eleanor Bennett," Claire said, a hint of nervousness in her voice that he'd never heard before. Eleanor Bennett was in her 70s, her once dark hair now silver, her posture still straight despite her years. She extended her hand to James with a direct gaze that mirrored her daughter's. "Mr. Henderson, I've heard a great deal about you and your farm." James shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Bennett. Claire's told me about your family's farm in Kansas." A shadow crossed Eleanor's face, but she nodded. "Yes, we lost it in '97. Never thought I'd set foot on a working farm again, to be honest. Too many memories." She looked around at the thriving fields, the research facilities under construction, the diverse crowd engaged in animated conversations about agriculture. But Claire insisted I should see what's happening here, said it was important to her. The significance of the visit wasn't lost on James. For Eleanor to return to a farm after the trauma of losing her family's land represented a profound step. "Would you like a personal tour?" he offered. "Away from the crowds?" Eleanor's expression softened with relief. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Henderson." James led Claire and her mother to a quieter section of the property, where they could talk without interruption. As they walked, he explained the transformation of Oak Ridge, not in technical terms, but as a human story. His initial resistance, the gradual building of trust, the moments of doubt and breakthrough. Eleanor listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed her deep understanding of farm life and its challenges. When they reached the orchard, now flourishing under the new water management system, Eleanor stopped to examine an apple tree laden with developing fruit. "My husband would have been fascinated by all this," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He was always reading about new farming techniques, trying to stay ahead of changing conditions. But the resources weren't there for small farms like ours. The information, the technology, the financial support, it all seemed designed for operations much larger than what we could manage." James nodded in understanding. "That was true for too long. Still is, in many ways. But what your daughter's doing making these innovations accessible to farms of all sizes, that's changing the equation." Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I didn't want her to come today. Told her it would be too painful, seeing what might have saved our place, if it had existed back then." She looked at Claire with a mixture of pride and lingering grief. "But she was right to insist. What you've built here together, it's healing something I thought would stay broken forever." The moment was intensely personal. A connection between past and present, loss and renewal. James felt privileged to witness it, to be part of this reconciliation between Eleanor and the agricultural world that had once caused her such pain. He understood now, in a deeper way, why Claire had created the foundation, why she had stopped that day when her car overheated, why she had seen potential in his struggling farm when others might have passed by. As the field day continued into the afternoon, James found moments to observe the interactions around him. Researchers and farmers engaged in animated discussions. Local officials taking notes for potential policy initiatives, children exploring the educational stations set up throughout the property. Oak Ridge had become more than a farm. It was evolving into a community hub, a place where different perspectives converged around shared concerns for the land and its future. Frank Olson approached him as the event was winding down, gesturing toward the research building under construction. "Never thought I'd see something like this in our county," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Always figured innovations like these were for somewhere else, somewhere more important." James understood the sentiment. Rural communities often felt overlooked, their challenges secondary to urban concerns, their knowledge undervalued in policy discussions. "That's changing," he said. What happens here matters not just to us, but to food security, water conservation, climate resilience. People are starting to recognize that. Frank nodded thoughtfully. And you're the one showing them. James Henderson, the most traditional farmer in the county, leading the way into the future. He chuckled. Life takes some unexpected turns, doesn't it? Indeed it did, James reflected, as the last visitors departed, leaving the farm in the golden light of late afternoon. A year ago, he had been a desperate man sharing his dwindling water supply with a stranded traveler. Now he stood at the center of an agricultural transformation that extended far beyond his own boundaries. The act of kindness that had cost him a few gallons of water had returned 100-fold in ways he could never have imagined. That evening, after the event staff had cleaned up and departed, James sat on his porch with Rebecca, Claire, and Eleanor. The day had been exhausting, but exhilarating, a milestone in the farm's remarkable journey. Max lounged at their feet, contentedly gnawing a bone, occasionally looking up as if to assure himself that his human family was complete and at peace. I've been thinking about names, Rebecca said, breaking a comfortable silence. For the research center, I mean. We've been calling it the station or the facility, but it needs something more official for the dedication ceremony next month. James nodded, having considered this himself. I was thinking the Laura Henderson Center for Sustainable Agriculture, as Claire suggested. Honoring your mother's vision. Rebecca smiled. I love that. Mom would be so proud. But I was also thinking we should recognize Claire's parents somehow. After all, their experience was what led to the foundation being created in the first place. Claire looked surprised, then touched by the suggestion. That's very kind. But the Bennett family demonstration farm, Eleanor interrupted, speaking with sudden clarity. Within the larger center, the working portions of the property, where farmers can see techniques in action. She looked at her daughter. Your father would have appreciated that his name associated with practical solutions, real-world applications. The suggestion felt right to everyone. The center would honor Laura's educational vision, while the demonstration farm would recognize the Bennett family's influence on Claire's mission. Past and present, loss and renewal, theory and practice all in balance, all connected. As dusk deepened into night, the conversation continued, plans taking shape for the coming seasons, for the expansion of the program, for the ways in which Oak Ridge might serve as a model for other regions facing similar challenges. The farm that had once represented failure and despair now embodied possibility and hope, not just for the Henderson family, but for the wider agricultural community. Later, after Claire and Eleanor had departed for their hotel in town, James and Rebecca stood together at the edge of the newly planted community forest. The saplings were barely visible in the darkness, their slender forms swaying slightly in the night breeze. They represented the longest-term vision for Oak Ridge and investment, in a future that James himself might not live to see fully realized. Dad, Rebecca said quietly, do you ever think about what would have happened if Claire's car hadn't overheated that day? If she'd taken a different road? Or if the weather had been cooler? James considered the question, the vast improbability of the encounter that had changed everything. I try not to, he admitted. The what-ifs can drive a person crazy, but I suppose we would have lost the farm. I was out of options, out of time. Rebecca nodded, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that bridged the reserved nature they both shared. Do you believe in fate? In things happening for a reason? James had never been a philosophical man, preferring the tangible realities of soil and weather to abstract concepts. But the events of the past year had expanded his thinking in unexpected ways. I don't know about fate, he said slowly. But I believe in being open to possibilities, even when they come in unfamiliar forms. I believe in the connections between people, between generations, between different ways of seeing the world. Why? He looked toward the young forest, invisible now, but full of potential. Your mother used to say that a farm exists in multiple time frames, simultaneously honoring the past, working in the present, planning for the future. Maybe that's what we're doing here, finding the balance between those time frames, those perspectives. It was a longer speech than he typically made, and Rebecca seemed to recognize the significance. She squeezed his arm gently. "She would be so proud of you, Dad, of what you've built here." "What we've built," James corrected. "All of us together." He turned back toward the house, its warm lights a beacon in the darkness. "Come on, we've got an early start tomorrow. Those soil samples won't collect themselves." As they walked home, James felt a deep contentment that had been absent for too long. The farm was thriving, his daughter had returned, and the future once so uncertain now stretched before them with renewed promise. The struggle wasn't over. Agriculture would always face challenges, always require adaptation and resilience. But they were no longer facing those challenges alone. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the early summer sun rising over fields that showed vigorous growth. James began his day, as he always had, with chores and inspections, checking irrigation systems and monitoring crop development. But there was a different quality to the work now. A sense of purpose beyond mere survival. A connection to something larger than his individual struggle. Claire arrived mid-morning, bringing updated designs for the education center and news about additional funding secured for the demonstration farm. They walked the property together, discussing adjustments to the grazing rotation, evaluating the effectiveness of different cover crop combinations, planning for the upcoming visit from international agricultural researchers interested in adapting the Oak Ridge model to different climates. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Claire said as they paused by the reservoir, now equipped with advanced monitoring systems that ensured efficient water use. "The governor's task force is organizing a congressional testimony session on climate adaptation and agriculture. They've asked me to speak, and I'd like you to join me." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. Congressional testimony? In Washington? The thought of addressing politicians in such a formal setting was intimidating, far outside his comfort zone. Claire nodded, understanding his hesitation. "I know it's a big ask, but your perspective is important, James. You can speak to the practical realities of implementing these changes, the challenges and benefits from a farmer's point of view. That kind of first-hand experience is what policymakers need to hear." End quote. James looked out over his land, considering the request. A year ago, he would have refused immediately, seeing no value in engaging with a political system that had often seemed indifferent to the struggles of small farmers. But his experiences with the foundation had shown him that genuine change required multiple approaches. Scientific innovation, yes, but also policy support, educational outreach, community engagement. "What would this involve exactly?" he asked. Claire explained the process, a prepared statement followed by questions from committee members, with travel and accommodations arranged by the foundation. "The session is focused on programs that support agricultural adaptation to changing climate conditions. Your testimony could influence funding decisions that affect thousands of farms." Put that way, it was difficult to refuse. If his story could help secure resources for other farmers facing challenges similar to his own, didn't he have a responsibility to share it? "All right," he agreed, "but I'll sigh. Need help preparing." "Never been much of a public speaker." Claire smiled, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you, James. And don't worry about the preparation. We have staff who can help craft your statement, practice with you. Rebecca will be a valuable resource, too. She has a gift for clear communication." As they continued their inspection of the property, James found his thoughts turning to this new role he was taking on, not just as a farmer adapting to changing conditions, but as an advocate for broader agricultural transformation. It was unexpected territory for a man who had always preferred to let his work speak for itself. But then, so much of the past year had been unexpected. Perhaps this was simply the next step in the journey that had begun with a simple act of sharing water with a stranger. The summer progressed with increasing activity at Oak Ridge. Construction of the research facilities accelerated, with the main building approaching completion and the education center taking shape according to plans that honored Laura's vision for Crowell. Community engagement. Rebecca oversaw the development of digital resources that would allow virtual access to the farm's data and demonstrations, extending its impact beyond physical visitors. In July, James traveled to Washington with Claire for the congressional testimony. The experience was as intimidating as he'd anticipated. The formal setting, the politicians, with their practiced manners, the cameras recording every word. But when it came time to speak, he found clarity in focusing on what he knew best. The practical realities of adapting a working farm to changing conditions, the challenges overcome, the lessons learned, and the support necessary for others to follow a similar path. "I'm not a scientist or a policy expert," he told the committee. "I'm a farmer who almost lost everything before finding a new way forward. What saved my operation wasn't just technology or funding, though both were essential. It was a partnership that valued traditional agricultural knowledge while introducing innovation, that recognized the unique characteristics of my land, while applying broader principles of sustainability." The committee members asked thoughtful questions about the costs of implementation, the time frame for seeing results, the potential for scaling the Oak Ridge model to different agricultural regions. James answered, honestly, acknowledging limitations and challenges while emphasizing the broader benefits not just to individual farmers, but to water conservation, soil health, and food security. "The question isn't whether we can afford to make these changes," he concluded. "It's whether we can afford not to. Every farm lost to drought or flooding or depleted soil isn't just a personal tragedy for that farmer's family. It's a loss of food production capacity, of rural economic stability, of generational knowledge about the land. Investing in agricultural adaptation isn't charity, it's national security." The testimony generated significant attention, with agricultural publications featuring interviews with James and Claire, environmental organizations highlighting Oak Ridge as a model of successful burra adaptation, and several congressional representatives expressing interest in visiting the farm to see the systems firsthand. James returned home with a new appreciation for the power of storytelling, the importance of ensuring that farmers' voices were heard in policy discussions that would shape their future. August brought the dedication ceremony for the Research Center, now officially named the Laura Henderson Center for Sustainable Agriculture. The event attracted an even larger crowd than the field day had, with state and local officials joining farmers, researchers, and community members in celebrating what Oak Ridge had become. The governor delivered remarks praising the innovative partnership between the foundation and the Henderson family, announcing a new state program to support similar initiatives on other farms. As James stood beside Rebecca during the ribbon cutting, he felt Laura's presence keenly. She would have been proud of this moment not just of the center bearing her name, but of the community gathered around it, the dialogue between different perspectives, the focus on education and outreach that had always been central to her vision for the farm. The Bennett family demonstration farm was also formally established, with Eleanor participating in the ceremony alongside Claire. The working portions of the property now carried signage explaining the various techniques being implemented, with regular tours available for farmers interested in practical applications. Eleanor, who had initially been reluctant to engage with agricultural settings after her family's loss, found unexpected healing in seeing her husband's name associated with innovative solutions that might help other farmers avoid the fate his operation had suffered. By September, the farm was preparing for its second harvest under the new systems. Early indicators suggested yields would substantially exceed the previous years, with soil health metrics showing continued improvement. The grazing cough component had expanded, with the regenerative impact of the managed cattle herd clearly visible in the improved pasture areas. The community forest was establishing well, the saplings showing vigorous growth despite the continuing challenges of the regional climate. James and Claire stood at the edge of the main cornfield one evening, assessing the nearly mature crop. The plants stood tall and calm, strong, their ears well developed despite water usage significantly below traditional requirements. The monitoring system showed optimal soil moisture levels, the result of precision irrigation, combined with improved organic matter content that enhanced water retention. "I remember standing here a year ago," Claire said, "trying to explain the potential I saw in your land. You were skeptical, to put it mildly." James smiled at the memory. Had reason to be. Promises are easy to make. Results are harder to deliver. "And now?" Claire asked, gesturing toward the thriving crop. Now I'm a convert, James admitted, not just to the technology, but to the whole approach, the partnership, the knowledge sharing, the community engagement. He looked toward the research center, where lights burned in the offices despite the late hour, researchers analyzing data, preparing publications, developing enhancements to the systems. Never thought I'd see scientists working on my land, or policymakers asking for my opinion, or neighboring farmers looking to me for advice. Claire's expression was thoughtful. That's how change happens, not through grand declarations or sweeping policies, but through individual transformations that ripple outward. Your willingness to adapt, to share what you've learned, to become an advocate that's as important as any technological innovation we've implemented. As they walked back toward the house, where Rebecca was hosting a meeting with local agricultural extension agents interested in replicating elements of the Oak Ridge approach, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a car overheating on a drought-stricken day. The simple act of sharing water with a stranger had set in motion a transformation that extended far beyond his own boundaries, creating ripples that continued to expand in ways he could never have anticipated. The future still held challenges. Climate patterns would continue to shift, markets would fluctuate, new technologies would require adaptation and learning. But Oak Ridge was now positioned to face those challenges from a place of strength rather than vulnerability, with resources, partnerships, and knowledge that made resilience possible. The farm that had nearly been lost would now continue, sustaining not just the Henderson family, but a broader community of farmers, researchers, students, and advocates working toward a more sustainable, crass, agricultural future. That night, as James sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky, Max dozing at his feet, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the rain that had finally come, yes, but more importantly, for the connections that had formed during the drought between past and future, between traditional and innovative approaches, between different ways of valuing and caring for the land. These connections had saved Oak Ridge, transforming it from a struggling operation on the brink of foreclosure into a vibrant center for agricultural innovation, education, and community engagement. The farm had changed, and so had he. The James Henderson who had reluctantly shared his dwindling water supply with a stranger was not the same man who now sat contemplating the interconnected systems that sustained his revitalized land. He had learned to balance reverence for tradition with openness to change, independence with partnership, personal responsibility with shared purpose. In saving his farm, he had discovered new dimensions of his own capacity for adaptation, leadership, and vision. As the season turned toward harvest, James embraced the work with renewed energy and purpose. The fields that had once represented failure and disappointment now promised abundance and sustainability. The land that had been in his family for 4 generations would continue to the 5th and beyond, its story evolving but its essence preserved. And the water that he had once measured so carefully, rationing every precious drop, now flowed more efficiently through systems designed to honor its value while maximizing its benefit. The drought that had threatened everything had ultimately revealed possibilities that might otherwise have remained undiscovered. In the midst of crisis, James had found not just survival, but renewal for his land, his family legacy, and his own understanding of what it meant to be a steward of the soil in changing times. The journey had been difficult, marked by moments of doubt and resistance, but the destination proved worth every challenging step. Oak Ridge Farm, once at risk of becoming another statistic in the ongoing loss of family agricultural operations, had instead become a beacon of innovation and hope for farms facing similar challenges across the country and beyond. Its transformation represented not an abandonment of agricultural tradition, but an evolution honoring the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future, creating a model of sustainability that could endure for generations to come. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness, a farmer sharing his water with a thirsty traveler on a hot summer day. In that moment of generosity, despite his own scarcity, James Henderson had unknowingly taken the first step toward abundance, not just for himself, but for all those who would benefit from the renewed life and purpose of Oak Ridge Farm in the years and decades ahead.